We are back, everybody. It is John Pollock with you. This is our UFC 252 preview show, and joining us, a man that I have known for many, many years. He is one of the foremost authorities, analysts, reporters out there. He is James Lynch, joining us from Vancouver, British Columbia. And as Interpol would say, James, how are things on the West Coast?
Things are great. What an intro, by the way. I got to give you props for that off the top. I don't think people have introduced me like that, but thank you for having me on. Always great catching up with you, John, and happy to be on here talking some fights.
You know, you have been a bit of an inspiration for me, James, because during this whole pandemic, I have reverted to just working from home, and it was a very tough adjustment for me to just work at home. I like having that separation, but I have found it has worked out very well, and I've navigated it pretty well because I looked at the amount that you can do churning out, and you and I are in very similar positions. We both have, I think you have a 2-year-old going on 3.
Yeah, exactly. He's going to be 3 in a couple of weeks. I think our kids were actually a couple months
very
apart
close.
Or something. Yeah, I remember that.
Because my son Max just turned 3 in July, but I have found it to be not anywhere near the concern I thought it was going to be working from home. And it's something that, I mean, you've done from the outside looking in seamlessly.
Yes. Well, I'm a bit luckier because I don't know what your situation's like back in Toronto, but the daycare that my son goes to, it didn't close because it's like a family-run daycare, so it's smaller groups. So luckily, my son's at home because my wife's now at home too with her job. So that could have been difficult, but no, it's worked out well. When we bought this house in 2018, I actually converted what was a laundry room into an office, so it's worked out quite well. And I got my own room and I got a bathroom and everything, so it's perfect. I got everything I need right here.
Well, once upon a time, we worked for a similar company, and I had to turn a broom closet into a podcast studio. So
that's right. Yes, I do remember.
You work with
got a little
got.
hot in the summer.
The famous dance studio.
Yes. No, exactly. And do you remember when you had an earthquake there? I was actually telling someone that story the other day.
We had an earthquake once.
Yes.
And I remember one of our coworkers just had not experienced an earthquake before, and that is the person I remember most from that earthquake. I barely noticed it, to be honest.
You know, I remember that because I was like, wait a second, this shelf shouldn't be shaking. What's going on here? So yeah, that was kind of interesting. Man, that was
given the time period, James, quite the metaphor being on shaky ground at that time.
Yes, exactly. Very good metaphor. Yes, good call.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're doing so well. As always, you're killing it with all your great coverage out there. And I just wanted to touch upon a couple of stories coming out over the weekend before we get into UFC 252. And a real intriguing one is the fate of Michael Chandler as he fulfilled the last fight on his Bellator deal and what the future holds from him. I don't disqualify the idea that he ends up, Bellator makes a very interesting offer to him, but where do you see his value in the open market? And given the pandemic where a PFL right now, that to me is a very risky proposition for a fighter.
Yes, I think Chandler's couldn't be in a better spot. I mean, you finish a former UFC champion, someone that hasn't been finished since 2014 in the first round, and now you're going into free agency. He absolutely killed it. And I think he's going to have a lot of suitors. There's a few options. You mentioned PFL. I mean, their season's postponed till next year, so maybe not the best move for him right now, even with the nice paycheck at the end. It really depends what he wants. I have this theory that he's made a lot of good money already in Bellator. He's sort of been the face of them. So what is there left for him to accomplish? There's the rematch with Pitbull, not exactly a big money fight. There's not many options for him. He's beat most of the lightweights in Bellator, so I don't see him going back with Bellator just because he strikes me as the type of guy that wants to test himself. And I think that it's either the UFC, because obviously you're going to fight the best in the world. He's got a lot of teammates from Sanford MMA that are in the UFC, like Gilbert Burns and, some of the other guys, Jared Gordon, that are training over there. So I think that's an intriguing option for him. And I think there's always been part of him that wonders how he would do over there, even at his age. I mean, he's not young, but I think he's definitely in the prime of his career. And then you have, one championship where you've got that fight with Eddie Alvarez that he could do. But, as a dad, do you want to have that much travel? Do you want to be going, and doing all that? And, there's obviously, like you and I know, there's some questions about their finances with one championship as well, too. So I would think if I had to put this as a ranking, I would go UFC number 1. I'd go staying with Bellator as number 2. And then I put sort of PFL one championship in the third spot. But I do think he'll end up in the UFC. Yeah,
I just you look at that top 10, there's not a bad fight to make there for Chandler. I guess the question is how competitive an offer does UFC make? How aggressive will they be in offering Chandler what could in theory be one of the last contracts he signs in his career? If you're looking at a guy that's 34, that, you want to make as much as you can in these, last couple of years of your career.
I kind of get the sense, though, it's not really about the money. I mean, obviously, he wants to get a nice paycheck going over there. I don't think he'll get the money that like Eddie Alvarez or Hector Lombard got when they were in free agency, because the lightweight division right now is one of their most stacked ones. I mean, you look at the top 5; those are all big draws as far as some of the names in there. But if you look at Chandler, like you just see him even on social media, like he's got a lot of sponsorship deals. He's got a lot of things that are, making him money outside of Bellator, and I'm sure Bellator is paying him handily as well, putting him in main events and stuff. So I have a feeling he'd be willing to take a bit of a pay cut just to go to the UFC and just to test things out, because really for him, if he stays in Bellator, yeah, I'll make more money, but then what do you do? Like there aren't too many fights for him. I don't know if he would consider moving up or what the deal would be, but I just think the UFC seems like the best option, and I really don't think money's a huge priority for him as far as that goes. Just kind of the sense I'm getting just seeing what he's done with his career in terms of, making money.
We're also coming off the second episode of this current season of Dana White's Contender Series. 5 fights on Tuesday night, 5 contracts handed out, which makes 8 contracts and 9 fights between 2 weeks. Poor Jerome Rivera, the only winner not to be walking away with a deal. But I love this show. It's like such an easy watch every Tuesday night. And on Tuesday, we saw Impa Kasanganay, TJ Laramie, Corey McKenna, Adrian Yanez, and Dustin Stoltzfus, with just a gruesome ending to that fight where Joe Pyfer's arm just snapped. It just looked hideous. But what did you think of some of the performances on Tuesday night? I was surprised all 5 ended up with contracts. I was thinking 3 max when they went to Dana White at the end.
Well, yeah, Giannis for sure was going to get one. That was like a highlight reel finish, fighting, knocking out Brady Hung. TJ Laramie, I was a little bit worried just because it did end with an injury, even though Laramie was in a dominant position, but glad to see Dana was as impressed as everyone else was. I mean, a little bit of history. I'm sure you saw TJ Laramie, not only the first Canadian to win a fight on Contender Series, but also the first Canadian to get a UFC contract on Contender Series. So really big win for him. And, John, we've been covering the sport forever. When was the last time we had a really hot prospect coming to the UFC that was young? It's been ages. So to see Laramie get the contract and do it the way he did was really exciting. Corey McKenna, I can't believe this girl, 21 years old, already has a lot of experience in Cage Warriors. So for her to go out there and defeat an LFA strawweight champion in Vanessa Demopoulos, really good win there. And Impa, great win there. But again, I was worried that he might not get the contract. I know it was the second time on the show, but going the distance, you never really know what Dana's thinking. So I think he made the right call, but you got to feel for some of these, fighters in lower ranked, in their particular divisions in the UFC, because they got to be sweating bullets knowing that they're going to do a bunch of cuts like they did last year. So that's just sort of how it works. They sign these new guys, they can get them cheaper, and then they can get rid of some of these other fighters on the roster. So I see the good and bad in it, but I love Contender Series. It's such a good format. It's easy to digest. They do a good job of telling the stories, and I think it's something that really should just stay forever and not bring back the Ultimate Fighter.
I was really happy to see Kasanganay get the contract, because you could even hear it in the commentary afterward. It's almost like a decision is almost treated like a loss, that there goes your hopes of a contract, that you have to get a finish to get a deal. And I'm glad that thinking, at least for one night, was somewhat adjusted, because I thought he had a very good performance. And to me, as was brought up, the fact that his age now, it's, he's getting thrown into the fire pit, because he's going to turn around in 11 days and fight next weekend. So yes. It's going to be a very quick turnaround there. So anyway, very interesting weeks of cards that we've got on the Contender Series. As we shift focus to UFC 252, I don't know about you, James, but we've known for a year this was the heavyweight title fight to make. It made all the sense in the world. And when it was officially announced, I just had the sense this is going to be one of the biggest fights in UFC history. Several days out, where do you feel this one, the buzz is at for UFC 252? And do you sense that this is going to be one of those marquee title fights in UFC history?
A lot to unpack there in that question. I love it. The loaded question. For me, this is, no, of course, got to keep me on my toes. No, I thought a couple things. I mean, if I had to rate this as far as the interest level, I'll use a steak reference. I think it's about medium rare. I think people are very excited about the fight. I don't think it's the type of excitement you had for, say, a Gaethje and Ferguson, or like anytime Conor McGregor fights. But I mean, look who's involved. I mean, Stipe Miocic, he's the heavyweight champion, but he's not exactly a personality that people are, just dying to see. But let's not overlook the importance of this fight. In my opinion, and I know some other people have suggested this as well, I think this is a fight that will determine the best heavyweight in MMA history, and that includes Fedor Emelianenko. I just think what's at stake here, there's so much, like, how often is it that we have two guys that are at such a high level fighting for a title, and it's a trilogy fight, and it really could determine, where they stand in history as far as, the heavyweight division goes. So I'm so excited for this fight. Someone asked me a few weeks ago, like, what fight am I most excited about? I mean, we've got Khabib and Gaethje and Costa and Adesanya and all these great great fights, but this is the one for me because it really, like, it's so rare to see a fight that's really going to determine a legacy for both fighters. And I think it's so interesting with a lot of the things going in here. You've got Cormier, who's older, who lost the last fight, but has had a full camp heading into this, whereas Miocic, we know he's been working as a firefighter during COVID-19, so he hasn't gotten an optimal training camp heading into this one. I mean, no one's had it fully optimal, but you get what I'm saying there. I just think this is such a cool fight, and I hope after it's all said and done, I hope this is, one of those fights that we look back on and think of how important it was in history. But and the other thing we got to point out is the odds. I mean, it's so close right now. I think the odds have flipped a couple times. I think currently right now at the time of recording this, Cormier is the favorite, but I know for a while Stipe was the favorite for a bit. So it's really interesting. And like I said, I mean, I'm picking Cormier in this fight, but it's such a close fight that really, if Miocic goes out there and does it again, I won't be shocked at all.
I think that's what makes it really intriguing for this third fight. It's not that they're just, like with Cain Velasquez and Junior dos Santos, it was 1-1, but I think by the time, that fight at UFC 155 to me was just so dominant by Cain that the third fight, I don't think Junior dos Santos fully recovered from the damage of that third fight, and to an extent the second one. But this, to me, this trilogy, especially just the dynamics of fight number 2 and how it shifted in the fourth round, you could go either way. It's such a hard fight to break down in that sense. And what the year away for Daniel Cormier, who's walking into this cage at 41 years of age, how does that play into things if we're looking at a fourth or fifth round this time?
Well, that's just it. And then you got to think too, Cormier, if you look at the two fights, he's basically been up 4-1. He knocked out Stipe in the first fight and then obviously was winning the second fight until Miocic made some adjustments and finished him here. So we'll see how Cormier looks. Age does catch up to everyone at a certain point. With a guy like Cormier or Yoel Romero, doesn't seem to be the case, but we'll see. I mean, and again, these guys have both had long layoffs. I mean, we're going to be about a year, just over a year since they last fought. So how's that going to impact them being out for that long in the fight? But it's so interesting to see how this one's going to play out. And again, this is like a perfect recipe, right? Like so much on the line for the legacy, so much on the line in terms of the actual fight itself, like what it's going to mean. And one other thing I wanted to point out, because I see a lot of people kind of getting this wrong. So Cormier's basically said, and I know it's MMA, but he said that, he's going to retire, win or lose on Saturday, right? So how's he feeling going into this one? I actually think that puts more pressure on him, because if he loses, I mean, that's going to be, that's devastating to retire off a loss like that. Conversely, Stipe said that win or lose, he's not retiring, and I don't blame him, because I could see a scenario where even if Stipe loses this weekend, he could still fight for the title again, because he's got that win over Ngannou. They could throw him right back in there for a vacant title fight and use his win over Ngannou as leverage to get that fight. So a lot of interesting things heading into this one, and that's sort of what I love to see a fight like this, where you have so many just intangibles that you normally wouldn't get in a regular title fight.
Yeah, and I guess it goes to that. We always kind of take promises of retirement with a grain of salt, and Cormier has certainly extended that deadline. But I'm going into this assuming it is his last fight, even though I fully believe that victorious, he's going to have to turn down an enormous offer that I think will come his way for another fight, that I think they will want to continue his career. But I do believe, mentally, he believes this is it for him.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And just think of everything that Cormier has been through. Even Stipe. I mean, here's a guy that no one expected to be heavyweight champion, and he's gone out there and set the record for most title defenses. And isn't it interesting too, John, that when you think of this fight, you almost forget that Stipe is the champion, the way they've sort of marketed it as well. And Cormier is a commentator for the UFC. He's got a weekly show on ESPN with Ariel Helwani. As far as fan favorites, DC's that guy, but Miocic is the heavyweight champion. It's kind of like an underdog story if he could go out there and get this win right now. And think about it. I mean, how often is the champion the underdog? It's not too often that happens. So that's another sort of layer to this thing, where it's I think for those who have looked at his career and just thought he would never amount to anything, well, here he could be the best heavyweight ever by defeating Stipe, or defeating DC for a second time.
One thing that we've seen throughout the entire pandemic and running these shows is that when the UFC has had a big pay-per-view, it's been that much larger. When we saw Gaethje and Ferguson topping 700,000 buys on ESPN Plus, 251 reportedly over 900,000 just on ESPN Plus alone. And I've got to think that given that this is the trilogy fight, the way it's been marketed, ESPN's coverage, I mean, I think that plays a big factor. I mean, is this one that you see hitting that million number, or do you see it coming somewhat below where 251 was last month with the 3 title fights?
somewhat below, but don't underestimate the power of Sean O'Malley in the co-main event. I've been blown away by, I do those pros picks videos. That's sort of a gauge of what the interest is like. I know it's kind of a weird metric that I use, but I mean, you look at the views on that video, like anything Sean O'Malley related is getting, as much attention, if not more than the main event. So I think that having him as the co-main event is a nice bump there as well. And it's a big fight for him, right? This is a guy that, even though he's not ranked in the top 15, I think people feel like Chito Vera should be in the top 15. So to have that as an extra bump to this entire thing, I think is going to really put things up. You've also got Junior dos Santos on this card. Like, I think those pieces will help possibly achieve that $1 million number. But if not, I think it's going to be very close. This is a big card. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if it does hit that number.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it segues over to Sean O'Malley. This is his third fight already this year. He's been, he's completely made up for that 2-year gap that he unfortunately had to sit out from. But like, this is, to me, Sean O'Malley is everything that was projected upon Aaron Pico playing itself out. And this is a fight that certainly it just springboards him that much further into the bantamweight, into that hierarchy, which is an extremely loaded division. Very important fight for Sean O'Malley on Saturday, and a very tough opponent in Vera.
What's interesting, Vera's never been finished in his career, right? So O'Malley, we've seen the highlight reel finishes. They're against, competition that I would say is lower than Chito Vera. So the question is, can O'Malley do it again? We're going to learn a lot about Sean O'Malley in this fight. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Edmund Shabazian and Derek Brunson fight a few weeks ago, in the sense that Edmund was knocking all these guys out, but when he got that step up, he ran into a bit of trouble. I don't think that's going to happen here with O'Malley, but it's certainly going to answer a lot of questions, because Chito Vera's not an easy out for anyone. Even though he lost his last fight, I think most people felt like he won. He realistically could be on a nice winning streak heading into this one. And you look at some of the guys that Vera's fought, I mean, they couldn't finish him, right? So if O'Malley can't get that early finish, and this fight does potentially go the distance, who are the judges going to pick? Because Vera's the guy that will put you in a dogfight, and he won't make it easy for you. So I thought the matchmaking here is very interesting, but the right matchmaking. I think Vera's not a huge threat, but he's a guy as well that you can't count out in a fight. So we're going to learn a lot about O'Malley in this fight. And I think if he does finish Chito Vera, you see him get that, that really big fight after this, and potentially fight for a title next year if he does finish Chito Vera. I don't want to look too far ahead here, but I think that's the way the UFC is going with this, and they're being very strategic about who he's getting matched up with.
As you've been talking to a lot of fighters and watching during this time period where it's such uncertainty, and guys and women are, some of them are not able to train at their gyms, are you seeing that bear out in a lot of the fights, kind of as a big picture? Because there is a discrepancy between those that, like a Stipe Miocic, who has a home gym, and others that, don't have those luxuries. Have you seen that play out, or have you been seeing overall performances at or around the level you would have expected in normal times?
It's been mixed results, because for some guys, they get to work in smaller groups. Like if you're in an American top team, you're not in a huge group getting lost in the shuffle. You're getting to work with smaller groups because especially because they've had some COVID cases. So they're really sort of narrowing things down. Look at someone like Tanner Boser. He didn't even get a camp his last couple fights, but instead he was able to focus on his cardio, shed some pounds. He's looked faster in there. He's looked better. So I think it really depends on the fighter and the situation they're in. But certainly, for a guy like Stipe, that is something I'm looking at in this fight, where it's like, hey, you didn't get to train for a couple months properly. And even now, when I interviewed him a couple weeks ago, he said he was only in the gym maybe twice a week. That's gotta hurt his training camp when you got a guy like Cormier who can go in there every day. So I think it really just depends on the fighter and who they're matched up with and everything. But you look at the results, they've been mixed. I mean, for certain fighters, it is impacting them, and they're not getting that type of training they want. But you look at a guy like Volkanovski. There's a good example. Didn't even get to train at City Kickboxing, and ended up putting on a pretty good performance against Max Holloway, in a controversial decision, so to speak. But still, it's really for each. It really comes down to the fighter and how it's best suited for them.
Junior dos Santos, Jairzinho Rozenstruik here at heavyweight. I don't think we're looking at, the next in line here, by any stretch, but in terms of, Rozenstruik obviously looking to bounce back in this fight. For Junior dos Santos, I mean, at this stage is the idea of him being in that top mix, are we kind of removed from that when it comes to Junior dos Santos? And how much does the outcome of this fight answer that question?
Oh, it certainly does. I mean, here's an opportunity for JDS to go out there and get back in that contender spot, right? Because Rozenstruik, in my opinion, there's some questions about that winning streak heading into the Ngannou fight. Even the Overeem fight that he had, he was losing it. He got sort of a last-minute finish in that one. So we're going to get a lot of answers in this fight as far as that goes. I think if you're looking at this fight on paper, I think JDS is the better fighter between the two. If you look at the resume he's had, you look at the accomplishments, the level of competition certainly is a lot better. And I see that he is an underdog right now. But saying that, he's taken a lot of damage, John. You referenced the Kane fight. He's been knocked out by Blades, and he's been knocked out by Ngannou and all these other fighters. So that adds up. Whereas Rozenstruik, not much damage at all. And then you got to add in the other factor. These guys are teammates at American Top Team. So I know they're training at different gyms, but I got to wonder, are there some training partners that maybe he could have used for this fight that he can't out of loyalty? It's really tough to say. So I really sort of look at what these two are sort of facing heading into this fight. And I actually think Rozenstruik's going to win this one because it's a 3-round fight. Rozenstruik's got really good knockout power. If JDS throws a shot, is Rozenstruik going to go down? It's tough to say. Overeem couldn't do it. Ngannou could, but Ngannou's knocking out everyone. I think if Rozenstruik hits JDS, he's going to go out just with the amount of damage he's taken. It's more of a case of a guy that I think has taken too much wear and tear, and a guy in Rozenstruik who, while he doesn't have the resume, he could take advantage here.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the concern when you're looking at a guy in JDS. Like his last 5 losses, they've been stoppages. He's 36 now. When you're looking at, especially with a power puncher in Rozenstruik, and you add that to the fact that we are in the smaller octagon, how much stake or stock do you put into, especially heavyweights in the smaller octagon? Do you think it's a large factor, or is it somewhat overblown in your estimation?
Somewhere in the middle. I think it does help. We've seen more knockouts. Certainly it's, we've seen that in a lot of the cards that are at the Apex. You are seeing a lot of finishes. I think it depends on the fighter. And that's actually something we didn't even mention in the main event. Like, I almost think that favors DC a little bit, having the smaller cage. Cause I think, and people debated me on this, but I do think DC packs a little bit more of a punch than Stipe does, even though Stipe's got the boxing resume, being a Golden Gloves guy. But, back to this fight, as far as heavyweights, I think it does play a role. And I think that's why the UFC likes going there, aside from the fact, they're not paying any extra money to host the events there. You do see more finishes. So I don't think it's like the factor. I think it's somewhere in the middle between overblown and it being like the biggest thing ever.
And you had quite the spirited interview with Vince from Hell Pichel recently. Yes. And Pichel is going to be taking on Jim Miller. This is obviously one that kind of stands out on this undercard, but just any highlights that you're looking towards on the prelims leading into the pay-per-view?
Yeah, a couple ones. I mean, we can mention that fight quickly. I think it's interesting that Jim Miller's the underdog in this fight because he's been a lot more active, and you've just seen the ground game that he possesses. I think that we could see another upset here with Jim Miller. Can't count him out. And I think people forget that Miller's actually younger than Vince Pichel. Like, Pichel's 37.
Crazy. That's just absolutely crazy.
I know it's one of those things you just, you look at the fight and you're like, oh yeah, he must be younger. But no, Pichel has hardly fought. I think he's fought maybe like once a year. So I look at those things when it comes to breaking it down. This Herbert Burns and Daniel Pineda fight's interesting. I'm not sure why Pineda was brought in. If you remember, he had that no contest in PFL against Jeremy Kennedy. He won the fight, but he got popped for PEDs, and now he's in the UFC again. It's a little odd in fighting a really tough guy in Herbert Burns. So that's an interesting one. Could be potential fight of the night there. This Felice Herrig and Janaroba fight's interesting because Herrig hasn't fought since 2018. What's she going to look like? I think Herrig's the better fighter on paper, but when you've had that long of a layoff and you're in your mid-30s, it usually doesn't bode too well. So that's another interesting fight. And then this TJ Brown and Danny Chavez fight. Like, Brown had a really disappointing debut in his when he fought Jordan Griffin, ended up losing that one. Can he bounce back here against a guy in Chavez who's really carved out his teeth on the regional scene? 10-3 record. I think that's another fight we should be keeping an eye on. Brown's got a great ground game, but he got submitted in his last fight. So we'll see what the game plan is for Danny Chavez in this one, but that's another one I would sort of keep an eye on. But there's some, not the biggest names on the undercard, but there are some sneaky good fights that they've added. And even this Christopher Dawkins fight, Parker Porter, by the way, one of the best names in MMA. That's awesome. Parker Porter actually fought Jon Jones in his third pro fight. A lot of people don't know that. 35 years old, probably didn't think he'd ever be anywhere close to the UFC at this stage in his career, but here he is fighting Christopher Dawkins, the brother of Kyle Dawkins, who's the UFC middleweight. So really fun one as well. So this prelims has a little bit of everything. Really looking forward to it.
Very much a superhero alias in Parker Porter.
Parker Porter, yes, exactly. It's like Peter Parker and Porter. I don't know.
It's like
Porter,
the guy that's trying to sneak in backstage. It's like, what's your name? Parker Porter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, that's great.
In terms of, that we've seen so many cards now rolled out like this, and it's going to be a long time before we're ever looking at fans. How have you, and I'm sure you've been watching a lot of hockey as well, like compare this to like the other sports. How is the UFC, what's worked, what hasn't worked in this new environment where you don't have the foundation of a fan base there?
You know, it's weird with the UFC. I find it's not really noticeable. Like, obviously, not seeing the fighters in the cage because they've done the split screen thing. I thought when Bellator last week did like the in-ring interviews where like the fighters 6 feet apart, that looked weird. But when they do the side-by-side letterbox, sort of a remote style interview, I think it's fine. But I haven't really noticed it, to be honest. And I think it's because we're so used to watching, the Ultimate Fighter or Contender series where there just aren't a lot of people in the audience anyways. So I think it's almost been seamless. I tried watching the NBA a few weeks ago, and it doesn't translate at all. There's so much crowd involvement in that, so it's like it's almost unwatchable. Hockey, they do pump in the crowd noise a little bit, so that hasn't been as noticeable either. But I haven't found it to be too much of a difference. Like I sort of just treat it like a Contender series card, and it's to me it hasn't really taken away at all. So kudos to the UFC. I don't know what they've done in terms of the production, but to me it's looked pretty seamless for the most part.
I'm with you. Like I think from the first one that I watched, I found it not only that it wasn't weird to watch, and like just watching like so much pro wrestling where it's been hit and miss, but it lacks a lot. Whereas this, like, it was seamless for me. Like I have not found really anything. In fact, in some cases, like you are able to hear a lot of things that traditionally you don't. Like it's an adjustment, but to me, it's worked out pretty well for them.
Yeah. And I think, kudos to them. I mean, we thought these events weren't even going to happen. And if you look at all the other major sports, you look at what's going on in Major League Baseball, the disaster they're having with not doing a hub city, the UFC's kind of been ahead of this thing, and kudos to them because, there's a lot of people who thought this was a bad idea. And now the UFC have sort of been the leader on this, which is kind of crazy. Very 2020 of the UFC to be the leader of this compared to all the other major sports.
You mentioned it off the top, like they have pretty much rolled out like their main events for all of their pay-per-views through November. Beyond this weekend, I mean, where is kind of your interest focused on in terms of like the larger fights in the remaining months of 2020?
I like the Adesanya Costa fight. Actually just broke that down this morning on my Rockfin channel. Went sort of in depth on that one. I forgot how like interesting that matchup is because obviously Costa's undefeated. Well, they're both undefeated, but Adesanya's got so much experience in terms of not just MMA, but kickboxing as well. So that adds another layer to it. And then he had that bad fight against Romero. So that's interesting. Whereas Romero, the fight with Costa looked really good. So that's an interesting one. Obviously Habib and Gaethje is going to be great. I just spoke to Austin Hubbard this morning, who's trains with Justin Gaethje. He's already in there getting ready for his fight, Gaethje, that is. So that's going to be a fun one, especially with them having the same manager. That adds a little extra layer into this thing. And then, the rest of the year, I think there's a lot of just, fun fights that are kind of flying under the radar. You've got Holman Aldana, which was rebooked. I think that's going to be an interesting fight for bantamweight. And who knows what's going on with Amanda Nunes. So I think the UFC's kind of figured out their schedule. A lot of people are like, how are they going to survive without Conor and Masvidal and Jones and all these? Well, they're figuring it out, and they always do. That's the one thing with the UFC. They have a backup plan if things don't go. And I think a lot of these fights are still pretty solid as far as what we got the rest of the year. So again, kudos to the UFC for making it work because they're keeping us entertained every week.
What is your forecast on Jon Jones over the next 6 to 12 months?
I don't think he fights this year. I really feel like him and Conor McGregor, unless they throw some serious money at them, I don't see them coming back this year until there's at least some sort of crowds, because I think they lose out a lot on their payday when you're not having crowds there, unless they can somehow do it. But it's funny because the UFC says they're doing fine financially, but they don't want to fork out the money to do that. But I get it at the same time, because it's like, if you want to do Jon Jones and Francis, you're not doing that without a crowd. That seems crazy to me. And then even with McGregor, like, what's a McGregor fight without the crowd? That just seems so odd to me. So I have a feeling until things maybe open up next year, I mean, who knows? We're seeing a lot of cases still in the U.S., so we'll have to see what happens. But I think Jones probably doesn't fight till next year. And I do find it interesting that they announced Thiago Santos and Glover Teixeira, but they have not announced what's next for Reyes and Blachowicz. I think you could potentially see an interim fight if this Jones thing drags out, because as of a couple months ago, he was like, look, I'm not happy with what you're giving me. So I think he could play a bit of hardball with the UFC.
As we wrap up here, if we are looking Monday morning at an MMA industry post Daniel Cormier, what are you going to look at as certainly everyone is going to remember the fights with Jon Jones. I would say that this trilogy with Stipe Miocic really rivals it in terms of just the competitiveness and what these two have been able to do. But what are going to be some of the hallmark moments of Daniel Cormier's career you look back on?
It's going to have to be the heavyweight run as well, just with the fact that this was kind of unexpected, John. Like, remember, the whole thing was he couldn't beat Jones, and then it was like, he's going to retire then, and then he goes to heavyweight, kind of unexpected move. I know he'd fought at heavyweight before, but that wasn't. I remember when that fight was announced with Stipe, it's like, oh yeah, I guess they could have done that. That makes sense. And he wins. Like, it was like, I remember Stipe. I can't remember if he was a favorite going into that fight, but it was just like, I remember just the way he finished him, and then it was supposed to be Brock Lesnar. So I think the interesting part of Cormier's career, especially if he wins on Saturday, is it's like he finally did it, because the whole narrative with him, you talk about the tragedies he's had in his life with losing his daughter to, not making the Olympic team, to losing to Jones, who was on PEDs and all these other things. For him to go out there and win the heavyweight title, that would, I think, be the story, is that he's really been able to turn things around and achieve that greatness that we all knew he was capable of. So I think that's going to be the main talking point, is just, if he gets it done. If he doesn't, then it's just going to add to that narrative anymore that, look, he got close, but he didn't become the greatest ever. He had some good, anecdotes. He has a great career, very well respected by all the fighters, but it would be sort of, he came up short again as far as that goes. So yeah, again, so much on the line this weekend. That's why I'm so excited.
Yeah, there's like a real incredible documentary there on Daniel Cormier when you look at all the different chapters of his life, and especially like the last 3 years that have just created a whole new one in terms of his MMA legacy that Saturday's fight very much hinges on as well. Before we get out of here, James, I do want to give you the floor to let all of our listeners know where they can hear more of James Lynch. You are one of the busiest men out there, and I know lots of people, when they're watching the Contender series and they want to know, who the hell is this guy? James Lynch has the answer for you, because he's probably interviewed him.
Yes. Well, first off, John, thanks for having me on. I always love catching up with you. It's good to kind of reminisce about the old days and everything, and really happy to see the success that you and Wei have been having with Post Wrestling. I love how you guys are doing your own thing and making it work. I mean, you're really setting the mold for a lot of us, so it's been really fun to watch that. Your audience can check me out. Best way is Twitter or Instagram, same handle, @LynchOnSports. I'm always posting my content on there. I work for like 10 outlets. I was telling you that off air. I also, host a show with Chris Cyborg now. I do a couple interviews for a couple promotions as well. So rather than spend 2 hours going through all my credentials of who I'm working for, just follow me there. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/LynchOnSports. That I post all my interviews there, so it's really easy to find all that. And thanks for having me on, man. It was a lot of fun catching up.
Last question, just as we come out, in the midst of this pandemic, when we're talking 12 months from now, do you see the MMA media landscape shifting at all when it comes to making a lot of difficult decisions, when it comes to we're still in the midst of this all, and then it's going to be surveying the damage, and I think a lot of media outlets are going to get hit. And do you feel like the MMA space of the sports bubble could get impacted there when it comes to coverage?
It certainly could. When this first started, I didn't think that was going to happen, because seeing people still do work, and then we started hearing about the furloughs, and then people like myself, I lost my job, and I don't know if it was necessarily COVID related, but it certainly has impacted everyone, and you're seeing a lot of people get let go. I know The Athletic went through a bunch of cuts. I think it's really the one thing I think it's really going to test a lot of media members is how creative can you be? How can you survive in this industry? And I think the people who are pivoting and finding ways to make content, or to to write or to produce video stuff or whatever, are going to be the ones that are going to be there in the end, because now you can't just get away with doing one thing. You got to be good at everything, and you got to find different ways to create content and to keep people engaged. So I think that's really what the test is going to be over the next couple months, because I don't think it's going to get any easier. I don't have any metrics to back that up. I don't know how the sites are faring, but obviously people aren't getting to travel as much. People aren't getting to do as much as they'd like. But yeah, going to be very interesting. But like I said, I think the ones who are going to survive are the ones who have been able to adapt and be versatile. And that's something to keep an eye on.
Well, I'd tell anybody you are a blueprint to watch, because I think more and more the future is going to be people that are self-sufficient, and maybe you'll go work to different outlets, but you have your home base. Like everyone, they are searching for James Lynch. It's not so much what the name is underneath your name. It's people are following your content, and you might work different places, but the consistency is you. And I think that is where a lot of the media industry is going, of people that will be on their own, and just people will follow the personalities. And
it's the brand. It's the brand. I'll just mention this quickly. Two people I think do such a good job of this, and they've sort of helped me kind of mold where I'm at. Luke Thomas, who's done a great job with his brand. I know he's not everyone's cup of tea, but credit to Luke for building up his channel and, having the smart idea of, doing a serious show, but also putting your video clips on your channel and really treating this like a business. A lot of media members are going to start treating this like a business. I know I am already. I'm already, adding sponsors to some of my videos and things like that, and trying to find different ways to utilize my content the best we can. Buchanan the Schmo. This guy got a lot of shit last year, let's be honest, from, media members being like, what is this? It's like a Nardwuar in MMA, but credit to him. He does everything himself. And I know just from talking to him, because we've had a lot of conversations, the guy's well researched, he hustles, and he's creating this new mold of creating his own channel, but having sponsors sort of make a living for him. So keep an eye out for people like that, people like myself, really, building a brand and really, not making it about the outlet, making it about the brand themselves. That's going to be the people who are going to be there in the end.
Well, James, thank you so much for joining us. Wei Ting, I will say on behalf of him, he says hello to Kermit from afar. So we wish you all the best.
You're welcome.
I didn't want to get out of there. I feel like I nag you with that one, but it's such a classic. So, continued success with all your great work. And we will be back Saturday night live, UFC 252 post show with myself and Phil Chairtalk, which you can watch live right after the main card, youtube.com/postwrestling. So go hit the subscribe button on that and follow all of James Lynch's great work. Lynch on Sports on Twitter. The man is just a fountain of information, and he's probably done 10 interviews already today with 15 on deck. So check it all out. Thanks again, James.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.